take us through the origins, if you will, of this John Bolton decision.
Well, Nicole, if you want to go back to when this was still under consideration of whether or not the House would subpoena Bolton and he would testify there, his position was, I will not testify unless I'm subpoenaed and a court rules in my favor, saying I have to testify. At the same time, what we heard from his lawyer was these sort of tantalizing bits about that suggested he really wanted to testify, that he knew things that hadn't yet come out publicly, that, you know, he was present for things that perhaps, you know, the House Intelligence Committee was unaware of as yet. And so all the while, so he was waiting for this court decision, but all the while kind of saying, look, I'm here if you want to talk to me. And the House decided thanks, but no thanks. And they didn't do that. And so according to Bolton's statement, he then went back and looked at these constitutional issues himself and just decided that he can testify, and that in fact the only one who has absolute immunity from congressional testimony is the president himself. And so he is now saying he's willing to do that, and he's going, and that he would, you know, essentially serve as a witness in the Senate trial. And that, I got to tell you, has the White House a little bit on edge for all the reasons you said. They've really feared his testimony because of everything that he knows. And so the real question is, A, whether there's several. One, whether Mitch McConnell will actually subpoena Bolton, and this will come to pass. And B, if he does, what would he say that's new? And is that persuasive enough? Or is just the optics of having John Bolton, who, as you just said, has been a figure in Republican politics for decades, testifying to the facts that we've heard others testify to. And does that have an impact on some of these more moderate Republicans? Those are the questions that we just don't have answers to right now. But he's willing to do it.
Carolee, I've described John Bolton this way, and if you disagree, please jump in. You've covered him and sort of his sphere of national security issues for a long time. But he is to conservative foreign policy what Scalia was to conservative judicial thought and policy. The idea that he could be smeared the way the Republicans smear Colonel Vindman, that he could be dismissed as hysterical the way they sought to smear Yovanovitch and Fiona Hill, as abhorrent as that was, is just not the case with Bolton. He is a conservative's conservative. He's in good standing among Fox News hosts, with the exception of Tucker Carlson, who's sort of a Rand Paul isolationist. And the idea that he examined, I mean, there is a 3-year record now of stonewalling Congress. There is more sort of cover for not showing up on Capitol Hill than there is rationale, legal or political or anything else, for walking up there. What other than national security interests and concerns about Donald Trump's foreign policy conduct would propel a decision like this from Bolton?
Well, I think that if you look at John Bolton's someone who has a lot of interest in, and he's a kind of an Article 2 nerd. He likes these constitutional questions are things that he's thought about for some time. So there's that piece of things. There's also just the piece of that he saw things that we all know, according to people who spoke to him about it, that he was uncomfortable with, that he disagreed with, and that he thought were wrong. And some of them were being carried out by people that, frankly, he didn't like and he didn't get along with while he was in the White House, and namely Acting Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. And so clearly he would have a lot to say about whatever roles those two had, and what his knowledge of that is, and whether there's anything new there. We don't know, but presumably there's a real possibility that there is. In terms of just him and being who he is and being unable to be smeared by the Republicans in this same way. You know, John Bolton has a super PAC, and that super PAC is supporting some of the senators who will be jurists in this trial. And, you know, so his ties with the party are deep, that he's not somebody that they're going to easily be able to distance themselves from. And based on all my reporting, what John Bolton would intend to do if he goes in there is just simply tell the truth of what he saw and what happened. And as we've seen, when you get other individuals who have witnessed these sorts of things, that what happened with the Ukraine matter, when they say it out loud, when the cameras are on, and it can sound, it can be quite damning for whoever he is speaking about, and to have John Bolton do that takes it to a totally different level.
So just telling the truth, Phil Rucker, would include either corroborating the testimony already on the record from multiple Bolton deputies, or basically calling them liars and describing their testimony as false, which there's no indication in anyone's reporting today that that's his plan. So what's already on the record from Fiona Hill and others really goes to concerns about the illegality of the Ukraine scheme. It's been corroborated in all the recent reporting from your newspaper, from the New York Times. Let me play some of the legal concerns that have been testified to being concerns that Bolton had.
A specific instruction was that I had to go to the lawyers, to John Eisenberg, our senior counsel for the National Security Council, to basically say, you tell Eisenberg, Ambassador Bolton told me, that I am not part of this whatever drug deal that Mulvaney and Sondland are cooking up.
What did you understand him to mean by the drug deal that Mulvaney and Sondland were cooking up?
I took it to mean investigations for a meeting.
Did you go speak to the lawyers?
I certainly did.
Did you tell Ambassador Bolton about this conversation as well?
I reached out to him as well and requested his availability for a secure phone call.
And what was his response when you explained to him what Ambassador Sondland had said?
Tell the lawyers.
Phil Rucker, we know what kind of lawyer Donald Trump wants. He wants his Roy Cohn. He seems to have that in the Attorney General. But it certainly brings the lawyers that all of the national security folks who John Bolton sent upstairs to the lawyers, if they're still on the second floor, into this conversation as well. And if John Bolton is willing to say absolute immunity isn't a thing, I wonder how many other people will follow him up to Capitol Hill.
Yeah, Nicole, that's a really good point. And something we should keep in mind about John Bolton's potential testimony vis-a-vis the testimonies that we heard in December and November of last year is that Bolton had so much more intimate access to the president. The national security officials who've testified before the House in their impeachment inquiry had a lot of information, a lot of vivid detail, and yet their access to the president was somewhat limited. Bolton was around President Trump for hours of every day, had lengthy conversations with him about Ukraine, about all sorts of other topics. And if he were to come forward in this Senate trial and testify, he could not only corroborate what people like Fiona Hill and Gordon Sondland and others said in their testimony in the House, but he could add new details, new information, and importantly, fill in some dialogue of things that specifically President Trump said or directed to his lawyers and to the other people in the room, and that could be very explosive to the White House, and I think is one of the reasons why there has been so much concern in Trump's orbit about Bolton coming forward and testifying.
Phil Rucker, did anyone at the White House see today's announcement from Bolton coming?
You know, it's unclear at this point how the White House is going to respond to this. They could certainly take some sort of action to try to compel or restrict Bolton from testifying. They've made it very clear in the previous weeks that they did not want Bolton to testify and did not want other senior officials to testify. Remember, the House wanted Mick Mulvaney, the acting chief of staff, to testify, and he was blocked by the White House from doing so. Same with Pompeo and other key witnesses. But if Bolton were to break with the White House, that's significant, and we don't know at this hour what the White House is going to try to do to stop him.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.